Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of eSIG. Nice to see everyone here at the beginning of the new year, and welcome to our eSIG monthly webinar for February. For those of you not familiar with eSIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of the energy transition. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group, and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. I also serve in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, the GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. eSIG leads Pillar 1 of the 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda for the system operators. It seems like just yesterday we finished up our fall technical workshop in Minneapolis, although it was at the end of October already, and here we are getting ready for the spring workshop in Tucson at the end of next month. And if you don't like the weather in Minneapolis this time of year, come on down to Tucson. The weather will be just what you're looking for. We did have a great workshop in Minneapolis, and I can promise you another one just as good in Tucson. Further information can be found on our website, and I'm expecting the final agenda to be posted within the next couple of days. Got a few last minute changes that are going to be made. Our workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the eSIG website. If you're new to eSIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. eSIG membership will give you an opportunity to participate actively in all of our working groups and task forces. You can find us on the web at esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For the Q&A, we're using the Slido platform. So to ask your questions, please go to slido.com and enter eSIG23 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the questions to allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize the questions submitted. We plan to save 10 minutes or so for Q&A at the end and then wrap it up at the top of the hour. An email with a link will be provided once the video file has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. Okay, today's topic is going to be on market design for future systems with a high share of renewable energy. This is a topic of ever-increasing interest and importance as we transition to a power system based on zero marginal cost resources. And here to talk with us about it today is Professor Ben Hobbs, the Theodore and K. Schad Professor of Environmental Management at Johns Hopkins. One of the things I love about Ben is his great sense of humor. If you noticed in the title of the webinar today, it ends with a question about market design. Fitness or witless for purpose? Hopefully we'll figure it out by the end of the webinar. Ben is also chair of the California Independent System Operators Market Surveillance Committee, which he has served on since 2002. So I think that's a good indication he knows what he's talking about. Ben's a Life Fellow of IEEE and a Fellow of Informs. In 2021, he received eSIG's Energy Excellence Award for contributions to market design for a renewable energy future. And he's a familiar face here at eSIG. More recently, he's a co-founder of the Columbia Johns Hopkins Future Power Markets Forum. Ben's a good friend and a good friend of eSIG, and it's my great pleasure to welcome him here again today. Today's webinar will address the evolution of power market designs, which were fashioned primarily for systems with dispatchable, non-storable generation. And we'll ask the question, are those designs fit for purpose for tomorrow's systems dominated by wind, solar, and battery resources? As you will see, many of the fundamental principles will still apply in the future, but there are several reforms that will be critical if we want to get the full economic and emissions reduction benefits of renewables moving forward. I greatly value the contributions of Ben to eSIG and the industry, and I look forward to what he has to say. Just a short reminder once again to use Slido at slido.com with the event code of eSIG23 to ask your questions. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Ben, I'll now turn it over to you.
Charlie, thanks so much. And Ryan, also thanks so much for setting this up. This is an incredible honor to be giving this talk, which will be full of a lot of opinions, and maybe one or two of them will be informed ones. I think Charlie generously expands my expertise beyond what it really is. But I'm hoping that the opinions will stimulate some discussion, and I'm looking forward to what everybody puts on Slido. I just want to mention that I need to place some blame on this. Actually, blame is on nobody's shoulders except my own for any opinions and errors here. But I have gotten some great help from students of mine, Qingyu, Shen, and Yinang, and they're also colleagues of mine on the Grid Management Laboratory Consortium, especially Eric and Auden. But they're not to blame for any of the numerous mistakes and opinions that are here. I'll be addressing the question today is the standard market design, this as FERC designed it, proposed it about 20 or so years ago, and then has been a bit modified, but is still basically the same idea. Standard market design fit for purpose today, given that we're facing incredible technological change in terms of variable resources and storage, and hopefully soon, please, a lot of demand response and distributed resources. And at the same time, we've got
we're not seeing your screen. If
Yeah.
you want to share your screen.
Oh, I'm so very sorry. There we go. Even after, okay, even after 3 years of doing this, we're still telling people you're muted. How's
That's
that?
interesting. I was able to see the screen, but maybe that was left from the our earlier session, Ben. I can see it now. Yeah,
We're cool. All right. So between the new technologies and ambitious decarbonization goals, we're dealing with different systems than we've had before, and different demands are being put on them. Thank you, Charlie, for mentioning the Columbia JHU Future Power Markets Forum, which has been its responsibility to review how to have discussions about how market design principles and practice should be changed to accommodate this flood of renewables and the demands. We don't debate the pros and cons of those goals, but rather how can markets help achieve them, and what needs to be changed. And recently, myself and my colleagues, Cheryl Laffer, David Hill, and Rob Gramlich, asked our members to review the topics we've had in the first 25 forums and tell us what we really need to be talking about in the future, what are really crucial. And at the very top, we have RA and transmission policy and planning, and on their heels, long-term procurement of clean and flexible resources, demand response and distributed energy resources, and the spot markets. And then there were a lot of other really interesting topics. You can go to our website and see some of the materials that are generated as a result. And so this feedback is guiding my presentation a bit, in that I'm going to be focusing on spot markets, on RA, and I'm going to say a little bit about transmission, which is a favorite research issue of mine. And in particular, after giving an introduction to power markets, because there may be people here, and I know some of my students are here, who may not know much about power markets and where they come from. And quickly we'll go to the first question, which is the basic framework of locational marginal pricing something is still fit for purpose? And then I'll turn to resource adequacy and capacity markets. These two are cornerstones of many North American markets, not European markets necessarily, markets elsewhere in the world, but certainly North American markets. And there's a question as to whether we should keep them in their present form, abandon them totally, or whether more people around the world should use them. I'll talk about some broad alternatives for future market designs, big alternatives, and I'll give you my opinion about those. And then finally, I'll point out that it's not, of course, just markets, but you need a framework infrastructure for markets, as you all know, of course, transmission, and you also need sound carbon policy, or if you have ad hoc, inconsistent carbon policies, you can spend a lot of money, endanger reliability, and have, unfortunately, nothing to show for it in terms of environmental improvement. Okay, so first, as an introduction, you all know at least the rationale for this, that building the wrong stuff, operating them inefficiently, high forced outage rates, and prices that have very little to do either with the value to consumers or to costs have been rationales for restructuring of the industry, which got going in the 1970s in the U.S. with the passage of the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, which was the camel's nose of deregulation getting into the tent. And then Margaret Thatcher and her famous purse in the UK saying that there is no alternative to privatization and restructuring. And she didn't need academics like myself to do any studies to examine it. She just, quote unquote, knew that. And so through sheer force of will, we saw what happened there. But at the same time, the intellectual foundations were being established. Fred Schweppe, I believe in that very same year, published his hierarchical control strategies paper, which may have been a confusing title, but what he really proposed was locational marginal pricing to motivate consumers to modify their use, defer uses, reduce uses, or increase uses according to system conditions. And then it occurred to him and his students that, oh, you could also do this on the generation side. And that's the intellectual framework for locational marginal pricing. And I'll be making many references to it. So in the subsequent decade and a half, roughly half the US markets were deregulated, at least on the bulk side, and unbundled. The California crisis put the brakes on that for a while, but now we're still seeing wholesale deregulated markets being extended, even if retail deregulation has not grown quite as fast. And we've learned a lot in the last 20 years about how to make markets more resistant to market power and to be more efficient and flexible. And we've made a number of reforms over the years to accommodate renewables and greenhouse gas policies and so forth. So in a nutshell, how these principles have been applied, how St. Fred Schweppe's dream has been implemented, it's been through short-run markets that, at least in the United States, your supply offers reflect your costs and constraints. The auctions co-optimize energy and reserves and the use of transmission with full network models. You have multiple settlements. And finally, the energy is settled, at least for many players, not necessarily all, at locational marginal prices, which that's St. Fred's baby. In the long run, what the SMD Plus includes is, for most markets, some sort of capacity mechanism, because between price caps and the difficulty of getting long-term contracts to support investment, people prefer not to sign contracts for 20 years on the consumer side. There has been a need for incentives to build things that the fear is that they otherwise might not get built. Now, Texas is an exception, and we can certainly discuss that. Another element of on the investment side are renewable portfolio standards, and of course the humongous tax credits we have in the Inflation Reduction Act, and finally FERC's encouragement of regional transmission planning. So here are two important theoretical results that I think inspire a lot of us to want to have spot markets guide decision making as much as possible. That is, prices that say where and when electricity is really most valuable. And one of Fred's results is that the solution to an optimal power flow can be under certain conditions the same theoretically as a solution to a competitive market, resulting in both efficient dispatch and, you have to read the book. I mean, this is amazing. Efficient investment, not just in supply, but even in transmission. This is a theoretical result. This is what, in theory, could be accomplished under a lot of assumptions. And second, the important result is that spot prices by themselves are, in theory, enough to make the socially most important investments also the most profitable investments. And revenue will be adequate to cover capital costs. This has not happened in practice, but it nevertheless is a guide that, so it results in things like my committee saying that to the extent we can, it's better to reward performance and flexibility in the spot markets where and when power is needed than through capacity markets, for example. But we realize that we can't get rid of capacity markets altogether. At least we feel that way. So there are a lot of assumptions here that we've mitigated market power and that the spot markets are not distorted by price caps, or you're not flattening price spikes by averaging over time. Everybody has perfect information. There are no lumpy costs or non-convex constraints. And finally, you can compute the solutions. And all these are assumptions that are violated to some extent in the real world. Nevertheless, I think experience says that trying to designing markets around spot pricing principles has resulted in a lot of efficiencies and is a good guide star for what we ought to be doing in the future. But so let's turn first to that question. Is the basic LMP framework still fit for purpose? And is it going to adequately incent the decarbonization that we need? Is it going to reward the flexible resources that we need to back up variable renewable energy? Presently, volatility is suppressed by, settlement intervals that are 5, 15, and 60 minutes when prices, marginal costs vary quite a bit within those intervals, which dampens the value, option values, which is how flexible capacity would make its money in a spot market. And likewise, market models don't tend to include explicit uncertainty, although obviously we have reserve products that are designed to deal with that. Third, here it is 45 years after Fred Schweppe wrote that article, and we still only have half a market. There's an absent demand side, but we need the responsiveness of the demand side to manage variability in the future. Can we do that? Can we, if we're going to be spending trillions of dollars on renewables, will we be placing them in the right places on the grid and distribution systems and elsewhere, given the huge disparities between retail pricing and wholesale pricing? And here's a narrower question, but a very important one. As we move from a system with mainly dispatchable resources to one that has more and more storage, particularly in the South and the Eastern US, the Northwest has always dealt with storage. What are the right time horizons to consider the use of storage in real-time and day-ahead markets Right now, we truncate those horizons, and as a result, we get incentives to misuse storage, to perhaps empty it early in the afternoon rather than hold on to it to the evening because, for example, price caps may suppress the value of power in the evening. So you might as well grab the money while you can, but that will hurt reliability. So as an example of the issues, the question is what happened to the active demand side that Fred Schweppe dreamt about? By the way, you know the difference between how you could tell the difference in a power systems lab between DC and AC power. Just see if this young man's teeth chatter when he puts the knife into the socket there. If it chatters, it's AC power. Some of my students get that joke. Okay, so we're still mainly half a market. We've spent $5 billion on smart meters in the US, and well, that results in more efficient billing, but we only have 3% of our residences on time varying rates. And most of those time varying rates are set ahead of time and they're not responsive to system conditions. So my snotty-nosed kid in Southern California pays upwards of 17 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which is some variation. But meanwhile, wholesale prices can vary from minus $300 to positive $2,000 or more. And so we result in situations where average retail rates are very high. So my snotty-nosed kid put 30 kW on his roof, shifting costs of the network to people who live in the apartments next door. And whereas that same solar would have been a lot cheaper to put out in the desert. So how will LMPs be affected by variable renewable energy? There's the perception that what we're going to get is prices that are bipolar in that they're either going to be zero most of the time, and sometimes they'll be sky high. And we've actually seen something like this in Brazil, which of course is a mainly hydropower system. Thanks, Eric, for this diagram, which shows that for the California ISO, we're definitely seeing a pattern of much lower prices in the middle of the day than we used to, and much higher prices here. And furthermore, these prices are getting noisier. Will this instability discourage investment? And will the flexible power resources we need to back this up be revenue inadequate? This was one rationale for the California ISO establishing the flexible RA requirement. So the reality is, I think that even 20 years from now, we're still going to see a lot of intermediate prices for a lot of reasons. One is that we're going to have hopefully zero carbon or low carbon backup sources that are firm, that will often be setting prices. We will, at least there's some folks who feel that the huge amounts of curtailed solar and wind will actually be used in power to X type processes, mopped up by, for example, production of hydrogen. So I'm thinking of the Evolved Energy Study with Princeton a couple of years ago, which thinks that we're going to have 5% excess renewables, not 33% in 20 years. Scarcity. Operating reserve demand curves, as was pioneered in Texas, and we're now seeing in many of the ISOs, those will goose prices to intermediate and high levels when capacity starts getting short. And finally, we might actually have consumers get involved, and we realize Fred's dream of responsive demand most of the time. Storage. Correct modeling of storage degradation will result in intermediate prices a good deal of the time, because basically deep drawdowns shorten the life of these things, and that's an opportunity cost that that ISO New England, for example, has shown makes a big difference in how you use batteries and in pricing. Also, the opportunity cost for storage will tend to rise and fall smoothly depending on expectations about scarcity. But we might see, and we have seen more extreme prices. It's just not going to be completely bang, bang, nothing or $1,000. this additional variation does not change Fred Schweppe's basic conclusion that LMPs can support optimal operations and investment. Magnus and Auden, for example, have a really nice paper where they take the classic approach that Schweppe used and Stephen Stoft used to analyze capacity investment in a spot market, and they show that throwing in VREs and storage, in addition to thermal capacity, will result in the same results that Schweppe found, that capacity, in theory, spot prices can support capacity. Now, that's not true in today's market, the actual spot prices we have, but what this shows is there's no reason why the expectation that spot prices provide valuable investment signals will change. And other folks, including Ross Baldick and myself and others, looked at putting in social goals such as emissions constraints, and the same result happens, that spot prices in theory could support the right investment. Magnus and Auden said, the basic principles haven't changed. Think twice before embarking on a complete redesign of electricity markets. Now, what about capacity markets? Capacity markets are there because the spot market model doesn't give the confidence to policymakers that the capacity will be there. And I've argued for 25 years that even if theory we don't need it, it's a relatively inexpensive source of assurance, especially after the California power crisis, that the capacity will be there. But those capacity markets were designed for thermal generation dominated systems, and now we got these new technologies whose outputs are correlated. We've got storage. We've also learned to our sorrow about extreme events, Hurricane Maria and what happened in Texas, the heat waves we've had in California, the recent events in the Northeast in December. And finally, we still have this nagging problem on the missing demand side. And we need to engage that, not in just spot markets, but also in capacity markets. I'll suggest three things. One, to deal with new technologies. I think the rigorous approach to calculating capacity credits, ELCC or effective firm capacity, they're pretty equivalent, with strengthened scarcity pricing in spot markets, will enable us to handle storage and variable renewables within present capacity markets. Extreme events, profound uncertainty, that's a role for government, for regulation, for NERC. And you've got to recover the costs of these things, and you want to do it in a way that doesn't distort decision making more than it already is distorted by the 40 cent per kilowatt hours that my son is paying in Southern California, which motivated his 30 kW solar panels. And finally, on the demand side, there are ways, Sev Bornstein of the University of California and others pointed out ways that without a drastic departure from today's retail rate structures, you can have a dynamic marginal component in retail rates and motivate some more of the demand flexibility. Things like using your home as a virtual battery that we pretty much lack now. And we also need careful evaluation of the demand-based capacity programs that have been used in RA markets, but whose performance has not been what we would have liked. So first on the correlated resources, of course, you all know the duck curve, which to me looks more like a penguin curve. You know, choose whatever fat bird you want. That's because of correlated solar outputs. And correlated outputs also give you the so-called Dunkelflaute, and I'm sure my German pronunciation is awful, but long tails of distributions where during the winter months, in the middle of winter, you may not get the wind, and of course you don't get the solar. And so the amount of battery storage you might need might amount to not 4 hours of battery storage, one Elon Musk battery in your basement, but instead something on the order of several hundred or even 1,000, which of course nobody is going to put that many power walls in their basement. So there are other issues as well. The timing of net load peaks shifts and is less predictable, and the marginal contribution of renewables to capacity declines steeply as you add more capacity of the same type. And capacity markets aren't used to that as well. So a lot of people propose this, and it goes back, of course, to the principles of Garver back in 1976. When was that? 56? At any rate, equivalent firm capacity. And Shen has shown that if you have a system with strongly correlated variable renewable storage, dispatchable generation, he's also looking at demand response. If you pay the marginal capacity contribution for all resources, and you adjust the reserve margin, the total amount that you acquire appropriately, reflecting the value of lost load, so you've got you're hitting your LOLE target or what have you, then in theory a capacity market can duplicate the efficiency of the ideal Schweppe LMP type of market. That is, if you have a market with price caps that suppresses price variation, a capacity market can give you the revenues you need and direct them to the places you need to get an efficient solution. Lots of assumptions there, but it shows that the basic analysis done by Stoff 20 years ago of capacity markets still applies. And the steps involved in such a procedure is, take an initial, you could call it an operating point or initial investment point, a guess as to where the system will be in terms of capacity, and do first order approximations around that using a dispatch model to see how additions of different resources affect unserved energy. That gives you your effective firm capacity, and then that's what can then be put into the capacity market and paid. If your simulations show that will give you a solution very different than what you assumed was the original operating point, then you might need to iterate. This gets complicated when you have multiple years because marginal capacity credits change quite a bit over time, but at least in theory this would work. Now, if you get the capacity credits wrong, what could happen? So Shen and also Cindy Bothwell, another student of mine, have looked at this, simulating a Texas-like system, and asked, well, what happens if you have the correct credits, which interestingly are very different, for different renewable resources. Not all wind is the same. And actually, the wind with the higher capacity factor might have the lower capacity credit. Solar in Texas is relatively high. Storage is 82% because that 4-hour limitation is a problem, as is imperfect forecasts and operations. So let's compare that to no capacity credits, medium, and very high. And what we see here is that on the left is the right, quote unquote, capacity mix from the right credits. And you see the capacity mixes change. If you make all the wind credits the same, you squeeze out one of the two wind sources. If you give very high capacity credits, you get a lot more solar and a lot less wind. And if your credits are too low, you get too little storage capacity and way too much gas capacity here. And the cost differences are, 3% or so, which on a $20 billion system is per year system, that's $600 million per year. That's not to be sneezed at. It's from such incremental improvements that we've gotten the efficiency improvements that we have from deregulation. So capacity credits do matter. It does matter to get them right. So another issue with RA is common mode failures and extreme events. In theory, you could put these in capacity markets when calculating LOLE or expected unserved energy, if you had any idea what the probabilities were of a Hurricane Maria or the storm Ivan or whatever, and a credible model to combine these into the consequences in terms of loss of load. And even New England's analysis, which is based on distributions of weather that they know, where they concluded that there's a good chance that they're going to have natural gas problems at some winter in the future. They didn't consider turmoil in the world gas markets as a result of the Russian-Ukraine war. That's an example of a profound uncertainty. Here's another profound uncertainty. Fukushima blows up and Japan winds up losing all of its nuclear capacity for at least a short while. And I know that Germany is reconsidering and Japan's capacity is largely back online, but this is a common mode failure whose probability you can't calculate, but may be something you want to guard against and consider, for example, diversifying your resources. So if one category of resources is lost, you still can meet demand. There are a lot of correlations among various stressors. When bad things happen, they tend to happen together, as Shakespeare told us. The 10 plagues of Egypt that hit California that include, among other things, kelp being sucked into the cooling water system of the Diablo Canyon power plant, shutting that down. What are those correlations? We don't have an awful lot of data. And so we may want to do some things from a regulatory point of view that aren't justified probabilistically. Interdependent infrastructures, Texas learned to its sorrow, is huge. Cold weather shuts down some power plants, deprives natural gas pipelines and wells of power, which freezes up the natural gas system, which shuts down more power plants. Definitely not a favorable feedback process. And I think this is a role for regulation. In theory, you can model this, but there's a lot of this sort of stuff that has to be taken care of in, for example, interconnection requirements, I think. Some folks have proposed insurance markets to take care of this, but there are some pretty knowledgeable people about insurance who say, especially extreme events like weather are correlated enough across the continent that that insurance markets, reinsurers are not going to want to take on the risks of another Presidential Day massacre in Texas. This is really a role for central planning, FERC and NERC rules, and the market can help if you decide that something is needed in terms of reinforcing the grid, say against EMF, then you can of course have various quasi-market processes to procure the equipment that you need at least cost and performance-based rate making to operate it and procure it efficiently. But capacity markets will not be an answer to that. And finally, the final point I want to make about capacity markets is we've had pretty disappointing performance of at least our third-party demand response in the California markets. This is data from the DMM that shows that the performance, for example, third-party participating demand resources in the California market has been, they're basically scheduling 10 and giving you 5 showing up. And we all know what happened in the heat wave in August 2020 when, by the third day of the heat wave, what you're able to get starts diminishing. And we need to improve the performance of that in order to have them be a reliable partner in RA markets. Okay, some alternatives for future designs. You may fondly or not fondly remember this version of Windows that what preceded Windows 7. It's now been 20 years. I don't remember, but it was disaster. It didn't work in the machines, and so one of Bill Gates's programmers walked to his office and says, "We have to start from scratch. Just tear it all down. Stop accumulating patches, and there's too much duct tape and baling wire." So Windows 7 came along and was a success. So are we at that point with power markets? Do we need to redesign them from scratch? Is the duct tape and baling wire getting to be too much? Well, the ISOs are proceeding incrementally, and the California ISO among them, one stakeholder process at a time. But the danger of kludges is that they accumulate, and soon the whole thing together may not make sense or collapses of its own weight. There are other approaches. For example, what if we had more of a EU type market where we have intraday settlements, not just day ahead and in real time, and don't worry so much about the internal constraints on resources, such as combined cycle configurations. That will incorporate information on the updated forecast more quickly. But the problem with that is that that would kill US-style market power mitigation, where we try to compare a resource's bids to offers to their costs. We're already having trouble with that, with batteries and hydro storage, just conceptualizing what is their cost and how do we measure that, and which makes market power going to be mitigation difficult for batteries. But unless we're willing to throw out market power mitigation, that this is not going to fly, I'm afraid. Some of you know Alex Papalyxopoulos, who has shown off his phone during IEEE meetings and said, we need electricity contracts like phone contracts. Consumers love zero marginal cost contracts. And after all, we're going to be in a zero marginal cost world soon, right? But in fact, spot prices will be significant. And at least I think there's going to be an important role for demand side response for prices sometime in the future. Of course, it wasn't in Fred Schweppes' lifetime. It may not be in mine, but I think it's important to provide price signals to consumers to be able to limit their use. Either that, or we have to find some sort of agreements where is the equivalent of giving a busy signal. You can keep your refrigerator running and some heat running, but you have to cut down your uses, your other uses. So if Texas consumers could have cut their use in half during the February 2020 event, if every consumer could have cut in half, there would have been enough power for everybody. But of course, what you had to do in the systems that we have is open up the breakers for entire feeders and black out whole sections of the city. So you either had everything you wanted or nothing, which is not a good solution. Another long-run design strategy has been proposed, which has a strong integrated resource planning spirit to it. Formulate a big IRP model. Have people then submit offers to build stuff, whether it's lines or storage, demand response programs, and then optimize the IRP model and sign contracts based on the outcomes. So I like models as much as anybody, but I have a lot of worries about a system where we don't know how this, what are you going to do about imbalances? How do you measure imbalances or non-performance? How do you penalize them without active spot markets that make sense? What do you do if somebody doesn't show up and goes bankrupt? This is a little bit down this road, but I think it's a good compromise between number 4 and number 1. It's incremental, but it's a relatively big step, and that's Brattle and others' proposals for clean energy procurement, where load-serving entities may be obliged to buy half of their energy from clean sources. and you have an auction that complements capacity and energy auctions. This can behave similarly to emissions cap and trade, if with some important differences, but is more complex. But so back 20 years ago, at the MSC with Frank Wallach and Jim Bushnell, we argued for cap and trade. We argued against this sort of system, but we recognize that cap and trade is a four-letter word and not going anywhere. We have to watch out for issues such as, well, do you have different flavors of power in the real-time market, and cleaner power getting paid more and other power getting paid less? And if we can't run real-time markets with multiple prices at buses, then do we chase away the clean power that we need for flexibility? In California, this is what things have looked at like. We've got the incremental duct tape and baling wire we've done is an energy imbalance market, and now the extended day-ahead market we're going to try to spread across the West to take advantage of load and resource diversity. The California PUC has not given the gold watch to RA, but has improved some of the details to account for things like shifting peaks. We're modeling the internal constraints of resources such as storage, and have even considered having an auction for amount of energy in storage. So we have, the operator knows that we have a certain amount of energy in the batteries at 6 p.m. ready to go. Revised reliability products, for example, a FlexiRamp product in real time or an imbalanced reserve day ahead, that is procured considering full network constraints. I'll just mention that we need good infrastructure, which means we need efficient and transmission, and we should be considering how transmission substitutes for other resources. We should have some sort of implicit competition among these rather than the right hand not knowing what the left is doing. And transmission planning should anticipate how the rest of the market will respond in order to be as efficient as possible. So this is a report that Jessica and I wrote on this topic for DOE last year. So as an example, Enong, son from NREL, who's doing her PhD with me, has asked the question, can we use transmission planning to yield additional carbon reductions in the West, even in the absence of carbon regulation in many states? And her answer is that if you have a proactive transmission planning model where the planner anticipates how the spot markets and generation investment markets react, you can get a small but significant reduction in carbon emissions by putting transmission in the right place. Whereas her model projects that the present system of California essentially just charging imports for imputed emissions might actually be making emissions worse in the West because of emissions leakage from California. The issue of emissions leakage between state-level carbon programs is just going to be more important in the future. And Chingyu, in his PhD thesis, looked at the issue of tagging and charging imports for carbon emissions. These are called bordered carbon adjustments. And this cloud of points shows a bunch of different 2034 solutions in terms of cost and emissions. And you want to be here in the Southwest. You don't want to be in the Northeast, higher costs and higher emissions. If you don't have any carbon pricing whatsoever in the West, you're down here, and we would like to move in this direction, but instead, carbon pricing in California may have made things worse. It depends on the details, but it's definitely ambiguous. But if instead of having a fixed carbon allowance surrender rate, you have a dynamic one that reflects conditions in the West, you can get some reductions. This is not a 50% or a 90% reduction in emissions. This is a 4 or 5%. But, in this world of state level carbon rules, it's better to have rules that do some good than rules that do some harm. Okay, so to conclude, I think that the principles, and this is just my uninformed opinion, the principles of the Standard Market Design Plus are still applicable. Applicable is kind of a funny name. It's a term. We can't literally apply these principles in the purest sense that St. Fred would have had us do, but the basic idea of trying to have most revenues go through the spot market, I think, is a sound one, and that is not changed by the new technologies that we have. And I think we can adapt resource adequacy to the new resources. However, extreme events is a whole nother kettle of fish. Clean energy auctions, I think that's the drastic change that would make a big difference in emissions and do so efficiently without disrupting present markets too much. I don't think we can afford to, for example, pay 2 or 3 times as much for our carbon reductions as we have to, because right now it's hundreds of millions of dollars, but when it's trillions, if we spend way too much reducing carbon, it'll either collapse of its own weight and we won't achieve our goals, or we'll be depriving money from other social priorities such as medical care for all. And finally, we need to complement market designs with effective and cost-efficient infrastructure and policy. And thank you very much. I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Indeed we do. Thank you, Ben. Just one quick question from myself, looking at your conclusions and realizing the applicability and the depth of Schweppes' work. Do you see anything on the horizon that may cause you to change your mind, or do you think that some tweaks to the current LMP markets with some additional modifications will be with us for the long run?
So I think a big question is what's going to happen with distributed resources. It is not inconceivable that revolutions in those technologies will give us a situation where almost all additions are distributed and the system in 2050 or 2060 is mainly distributed. Are we really going to be sending LMPs down to every can, or are we going to be, do we need another way of thinking about how we use distributed resources efficiently, respecting all the network constraints and providing the most value? So there are folks playing with transactive systems. There's some people who've proposed distribution level LMPs. I don't see us solving a monstrous optimal power flow to do that. That could wake me up in 20 years like Rip Van Winkle. And if it turns out that DERs are most of the new investments, then the whole way we do retail pricing and the whole way we manage the system may have to change. And I don't have any profound thoughts on what that might look like, but I think that's a joker in the deck.
Okay, thanks for that that insight. Let's move to the Slido. There's a lot of questions in Slido, and some of them have really risen to the top there. We'll go through a couple of those top ones in the time left. How can OPF support long-term investments based on today's electricity and fuel prices and huge uncertainties in investment costs?
So I think what you have is you have capacity markets, renewable portfolio standards, and clean energy procurement, and spot markets working hand in hand. And the relative importance of each, I would rather see spot markets play a bigger role and provide 95% of the revenues, and that percentage may decrease rather than increase in the future. But basically, by signaling that power is most valuable here at these times, I think that's a signal that capacity markets do a lousy job of replicating in terms of where exactly that we need stuff. We've, for example, on the renewable side, we've seen situations where with feed-in tariffs, people build renewables where they generate the most energy, even if it's at times it's not needed, and even if it's at places that are hard to reach with the grid, and that's incredibly wasteful. And Germany and others have moved away from feed-in tariffs for exactly that reason. Spot markets are a way to spot markets together with a renewable premium. You pay $10 or $20 per megawatt hour, but have renewables face spot prices, and you'll see, it's much stronger incentives for putting them where they're really most valuable.
Okay.
So in summary, I think they have to complement each other. We're not going to get rid of capacity markets or RPSs, but you can design them in a way where they work together rather than across purposes.
Okay, thank you. A comment on your pronunciation. By the way, you said Dunkelflaut just perfectly. And the question, shouldn't excess renewable energy curtailment be avoided for justifying storage facilities investments?
Shouldn't renewable curtailment be avoided? And that's a justification.
Excess renewable curtailment be avoided for justifying storage facilities investments.
So curtailment, to us engineers, not using something to maximum efficiency, there's something that we object to. But in any optimally sized system, you're going to get some curtailment. You don't build the church for Easter Sunday, for example, and leave it 80% empty the rest of the year. It makes sense to have some curtailment, just like it makes sense to have some transmission congestion. The question is what is the right amount of that curtailment? And certainly what you saw in West Texas in the before the CREZ process, and what you saw in China a few years ago, of curtailment rates of 20 and 25% because stuff couldn't be delivered to the market. That was clearly a sign that the system was designed in an imbalanced way. And Texas corrected that by building more transmission, as is China. But the target is not zero curtailment. And it could be that the optimal amount of curtailment maybe is 20%. In a 100% system, maybe that's, there is 20% that's going to get thrown away because trying to store it would be much more expensive and wasteful of lithium resources or something else. But it's an economic question. The objective is not engineering efficiency. The objective should be economic efficiency and sustainability.
Yeah, good response. Can you comment on the validity of Schweppes' theory when you get into scarcity situations? Particularly comment on how electricity markets are never allowed to fail.
So Fred Schweppes' whole idea in 1978 was scarcity is not bad by itself. If customers know something is scarce and have the capability of responding to that price signal. So go to the grocery store. If you see no prices on the steak or lobster, and so you grab some of it, and then you get a bill at the end of the month that says, oh, it happened to be $200 a pound on that day, and it gets wrapped to your bill. That's clearly incredibly wasteful. As a consumer, I could have had chicken or eggplant or something else on that day. We do have flexibility. I mean, the virtual batteries that are in our homes in the form of preheating and pre-cooling could be tremendously valuable and far cheaper than Elon Musk's batteries. But we don't see the prices, and we're not given the tools, and we don't install the tools to actually implement that. So scarcity, where consumers can respond and respond efficiently, is really a good thing, as Fred Schweppes shows. scarcity where consumers can't respond, and suddenly you have to open the breaker for a distribution feeder and black out whole neighborhoods. That's terrible. And so it's very important to distinguish between those two. And Fred was definitely looking for active consumers who, like with any other commodity, gasoline or anything else, respond to the price.
Great. Then we got time for one more question from Hannes Pfeffenberger here. Interesting question. The one event in 10-year standard is equivalent to a value of lost load of $300,000. Isn't that the main reason for missing money in the energy markets?
Yeah, so if that's right. So depending on how you calculate it as 2.4 hours per year, or it's one event every 10 years, you can get numbers that are that high. I remember working with a certain ISO that I won't mention by name. It's not the California ISO. That there was a thought, well, maybe we should create a demand curve based on the value of lost load. And then they saw what that would look like with realistic value of lost loads, given the reliability standards of a day every 10 years. And they said, whoa, that's 1 day in 10 years applies a curve way out here, but a value of lost load of 10,000 applies an entirely different curve. And we don't want to open up that can of worms. So let's just continue with 1 day in 10 years. But if indeed you're building the church for Easter Sunday, the parking lot for the 1 day per year that's going to be full, that marginal cost of that parking space or that pew is incredibly expensive. And you would have to allow spot prices to go way up in order for somebody to provide that. 300,000 is higher than I've heard, but it's definitely on the order of 10 to the fifth. Regulators aren't going to allow spot prices that high. And so you do have missing money. I think the missing money problem is perhaps not as important as a reason for the lack of investment as the unwillingness of consumers or LSEs to sign very long-term contracts because of credit risk or the illiquidity of such contracts and so forth. Either way, a capacity mechanism is a way to give investors some assurance of something they can take to the bank and allow them to finance resources that, at least in terms, if financed by spot market revenues, especially cap spot market revenues, the bank would not accept.
Okay, a good mix of politics and economics. Okay, we're just a little bit over the top of the hour, so we're going to need to wrap it up. I want to thank Ben for this very timely webinar and for the great insights into the past, present, and future of organized electricity markets, even if the crystal ball isn't perfect. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the video file has been posted, and we'll answer the questions we didn't get to and get them posted as quickly as possible, subject to Ben's good graces. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you again soon. We have another webinar coming up later in March on the AEMO's interconnection simulation tool. Pretty interesting what they got going on there. That's going to be followed by our spring workshop during the last week of March. Further information on all of the webinars and meetings can be found on our website at esig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails, and you're all invited to attend. Ben, thank you once again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank all of you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future, and in the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks for your participation. See you soon.